We're continuing in the season of Easter, and Easter is not just one Sunday, but the Sunday we call Easter Sunday is the day that kicks off the entire season where we celebrate the resurrection of Christ and look for his appearing in our lives, seek his power and presence. It's 50 days. It runs through Pentecost. And during these 50 days, we're going to be studying each week the ways that Jesus shows up to his disciples, empowers the church, and is present as the risen Lord. And we see this in the Gospels. Jesus just keeps showing up. He keeps meeting his disciples and equipping them to be sent out in mission. Now, this week we see again, we're looking at the Gospel of John chapter 20, and if you've got your scriptures open, you might just follow along with me, but we're seeing again that they are in that upper room, and it's beginning in verse 24. They're in that upper room. It's probably that same room that they were in before, the week before, and Thomas was not there before. Verse 24 lays out the facts of the matter. Here's the scene. Thomas was not there. They call him Didymus. He's one of the 12, but he hadn't been there when Jesus was with them before. And verse 25, we see the disciples testifying to their faith. They give their testimony. Verse 25, so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." And you'll remember that sometimes we call Thomas Doubting Thomas. Have you heard that before? Right? Doubting Thomas. And yeah, he's kind of got some doubt. Jesus tells him a little bit later in verse 27, stop doubting and believe. But what I think we really see here in Thomas is a vision of belief that is not secondhand. Belief that doesn't just take as accepted what he has heard, but belief that says, I have got to encounter Christ. Thomas has a faith that is seeking understanding. Remember, he's committed to Jesus. He's been with him through thick and thin for 3 years. And here he is in that upper room saying, I've got to see him. I've got to meet him. I've got to know his power in my life. I can't just be argued down by what you have seen. And the disciples, notice, they don't try to lay it all out with perfect theology. The disciples aren't trying to argue Thomas into a corner or make him believe something. They're just saying, we have seen the Lord. This is our experience. This is our reality. And you know, that I think is really connecting to what Thomas says and what Thomas is seeking, because the disciples are saying, we've met Jesus, and because of that we believe. And Thomas is saying, I want to meet him too. I've got to meet him too so that I can believe. And I think that we're all called to that kind of faith, to meet Jesus and believe. Now, do you remember a long time, well, back in the 80s, do you remember there was this, long time ago for me, back in the 80s, there was this television commercial. Some of you were around in the 80s, and television commercial, and it was about I think it was AT&T, right? And it was encouraging you to use your phone, right? So you could, now we've got unlimited minutes, but back then, use your phone so that you can rack up some phone bills, and it was encouraging you to use your phone, and they said, reach out and, do you remember this? Reach out and touch someone, right? Well, here's Thomas. Reach out and touch someone. Here's Thomas, who has got to reach out and touch someone, to reach out and touch Jesus for him to come to that faith. And when AT&T talked about reach out and touch someone, they were saying connect to someone's life. Get into someone's life. Reach out and call your mom or dad, call your son or daughter, call your friend or whatever. Reach out and touch someone. Connect to their life. And that's what Thomas has to do here. Thomas wants to reach out and touch Jesus. Now, it's a very specific kind of touching. He wants to see those nail marks in Jesus' hands. He wants to touch the spear thrust that Jesus received in his side. And you will remember that in the Gospel of John, we know Jesus' hands were nailed to the cross. And we also know that at the very end of his life, when they were breaking the legs of the others who were crucified, they did not break Jesus' bones, but instead took a spear and stuck it into his side to see if he was indeed dead. And water and blood poured out. So Thomas says, I have got to see this Jesus who has gone to the cross, who has died, who has suffered, who has bled. I've got to meet him in his risen power if I'm going to be able to believe. I've got to reach out and touch him. And we're all called to that same kind of faith, to meet Jesus, touch Jesus, and to then enter into faith, to then believe. And Thomas, he's Mary, she was at the empty tomb. We saw that a couple weeks ago. And Mary didn't know what was going on. But Mary, when she hears her name, Jesus speaks her name, she has this encounter with Jesus, then she's able to believe. And here's Thomas. He wants the same thing. He doesn't know what's going on, but when he sees Jesus and touches him, then he is able to believe. So it's not just this new idea of life in Jesus that is being talked about here in the Gospels. It is the experience of the risen Lord. And they're connecting, they're understanding, they're entering into this real lived encounter with Christ. And think about this. The disciples don't try to argue Thomas down. They don't try to back him into a corner. They just share their story. And their story is connecting to Jesus' life story here, his risen life. And I think that people really respect stories, right? People get stories. It's one thing to try to convince somebody what they're to believe. It's another thing to just accompany them and ask questions and say, well, how do you understand this? And say, this is how my life has been impacted by Jesus. And that's really what Peter, Jesus' keystone apostle, says back in 1 Peter 3:15. He says, be ready to give a testimony of the hope that is within you whenever someone asks. And notice that Peter doesn't say, be ready to have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed on your perfect theology. He says, be ready to give a testimony to the hope that is within you. How Jesus has impacted your life, how he's changed your life story, how you have reached out and touched him. And notice, too, that this is Jesus who is really alive. I mean, the tomb was empty, but this is not some kind of metaphor in the gospel for how God can pour out new life on people. This is Jesus' body being given new life. Now, his body is transformed. He is able to appear even though the doors are locked. Both times we've seen that door is locked because the disciples were afraid. But it is really him. He's touchable. He is encounterable. And Jesus, Jesus shows up in this place where they think he can't come. Verse 26, the doors are locked and he comes to them and he says again, peace be with you. He said that twice before, if you remember from last week. 3 times, peace be with you. Part of it is, don't be afraid. The other part is, this is the mission I'm giving you, proclaiming God's peace, forgiveness, mercy into the world. Peace be with you. And then he talks to Thomas, verse 27, he says, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side, stop doubting and believe. Now, notice Thomas had laid out a challenge. He said, unless I see those nail marks, unless I touch Jesus, unless I put my hand in his side, I can't believe. I've got to meet Jesus to believe in him. And Jesus encounters him at that place, meets him where he is. And that's where Thomas is at in his life, this place of questioning, this place of wondering how it can all fit together, and that's where Jesus shows up. And I am convinced that Jesus shows up in all of our lives. I'm convinced that there are points in our lives where God gives us a way out, where God guides us, where God shields us for something. I am convinced that all of us have had spiritual experiences. We don't always recognize what's going on. Sometimes on reflection, we understand more deeply the ways that Jesus has shown up in our lives, the ways that we have touched him. But I am convinced that God is present in all of our lives, that each of our stories is smudged with God's fingerprints. And sometimes we're not going to know that it's God until we look back. It's like that footprints poem, right? That we see the single set of footprints at one point, and then we realize that was where he carried us. I found this to be true in my own life. There have been things that I have dearly wanted, directions that I have desperately wanted to go, that did not play out. The door was closed, the light was off, take a different path, wait, or whatever. And as I've prayed my way forward, I've found that there was more at stake than I knew. There was more going on than I often realized, and that God had been present and active, even though I didn't always understand it or believe it or know it. Now, each of our stories has unique ways that Christ will show up to us and meet us. It's kind of like the great lion Aslan, the Christ figure in C.S. Lewis's Chronicle of Narnia puts it, "I tell no one any story but their own." Christ is present in all of our lives, and I think that there's going to be a way in which when we stand before him on the last day, none of us will be able to ever say, that wasn't fair, or you left me alone, or you weren't with me. I think we'll stand in the light of his face, and we'll see his guiding, and his mercy, and his judgment, and we'll say, truly, you met me all along the way. Jesus said to Thomas here in this passage, put your finger here, put your hand here, see my hands and my side, stop doubting and believe. He spoke to Thomas. He encountered Thomas, just like he had Mary, just like he had the other disciples in the upper room, just like he will the other disciple and Cleopas on the road to Emmaus. And I'm convinced that if we seek Jesus, that he shows up. Here it's Jesus' bodily presence, finger, hand, side. Jesus was bodily raised. The tomb was really empty. In the Gospel of Luke, when he shows up, he says, do you have anything to eat? Right? He says, I'm not a ghost. And we will all be raised bodily on the last day. It's what we call the resurrection of the dead, which is sometimes kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around, but it is a core conviction of the Christian gospel since the beginning. And he says to Thomas, stop doubting and believe, which literally is do not become unbelieving, but believing. Don't become unbelieving, but believing. Become the kind of person who stakes your life on me, who trusts me, who seeks me. And so here you have Thomas who is, we call him Doubting Thomas, but really this is a place where Thomas is seeking. Thomas is at a place where he says, I'm willing to believe if I can have this encounter with Christ's living power, if I can really meet him. I'm willing to stake my life on him if he comes into my life and is able to lead me along my journey. And so he's not so much doubting Thomas as seeking Thomas. And there's different kinds of doubts, right? Sometimes there are doubts where we just say whatever, this crazy stuff, I don't believe any of that. But there's also the kind of doubt that is really faith-seeking understanding. Faith that is trying to take another step and more deeply walk with God and know what it means to live before the Lord in the land of the living. There's also faith that is, doubts that are really a kind of faith that is questioning and wrestling and seeking. And I think that's what Thomas has. Remember that questions and doubts, you see people hold questions and doubts throughout the scriptures. And it's not always a bad thing. And in fact, think about Jesus' own methodology. When Jesus teaches people, he's most of the time not just laying it on them, not just talking. He does do some teaching, some talking. But most of the time, Jesus asks questions. Who do you say that I am? Whose face is on this coin? Right? Do you believe this? Like he asks Martha in the Gospel of John. You see Jesus asking questions. Think about how Jesus teaches. He teaches in parables, which aren't stories that go on top of, but parabalos, stories that go alongside of people's lives and their life story. So you see Jesus asking questions, Jesus showing what it means to have a seeking kind of faith, Jesus inviting people, come and see who I am, not just telling. And this goes back all the way to the Old Testament, where Jacob, when he meets God, he wrestles with God. And in fact, that's where he gets the name Israel, which means wrestles with God. And I think that tells us something profound, that we are called to have the kind of faith that's willing to grapple with the big questions, to wrestle with God, to say, God, what does this mean? How am I to live? What am I supposed to be doing in this situation? We wrestle with God. I think God meets us in those places and calls us to that, respects that kind of questioning. We have the kind of faith that, like Abraham, is able to meet God at the gates of Sodom and say, God, what if? What if you found just a couple of righteous people? What would you do then? A wrestling, questioning faith. I think that's the kind of faith that Thomas is showing us. And in 2 Corinthians 5:7, the Apostle Paul says, we walk by faith and not by sight. And so there's a place in which at some point we got to just believe and stake our lives on it and take a step of faith. We're not going to have it all figured out. We walk by faith and not by sight. But I don't think this is blind faith. I think blind faith is something different. I mean, blind faith sometimes is drinking the Kool-Aid. I don't think this is blind faith. I think this is faith that's willing to walk even though it does not see everything. And I think that's why Jesus specifically says to the disciples at this point, "Blessed are those who believe even though they have not seen," which is all of us. Right? That is the church that followed after the disciples. That is all the generations that have come. That is us. Even though we have not seen Jesus in that same way, we are still called to meet and to believe. And see, questions aren't the problem. Doubt's not the problem. The problem is not seeking. And Thomas is a seeker. Thomas says that if he can meet Jesus, then he will believe. He says unless. He's got to meet Jesus. He will not take his faith secondhand. I think we're all called to meet Jesus and believe. And part of this gets at what the meaning of faith is. Faith for us is not just knowing about Jesus, not just having lots of facts rumbling around in our heads. Faith is knowing Jesus. Faith is meeting Jesus. Belief is not about having everything fit together perfectly and making sense of our lives and understanding how all of our theology fits together. Belief is fundamentally about meeting Jesus. Now, there are time-honored ways that the church has said it is possible to meet Jesus. For example, worship. Especially when we gather to share the bread and the cup. Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood." And we see the early disciples when they meet him on the road to Emmaus. It's not until he breaks the bread that they know it's really him. We hear Jesus when we read the words of the gospel and his voice speaks to us afresh. We can meet Jesus in prayer, both as a gathered body and individually. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about how his people meet him through service. Where they are clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, and that was a way of meeting Jesus. We meet Jesus in his body, the church, which is really just another way of saying that we meet him often in other people. There's kind of this preacher story, but I love it, so I'll tell it to you, where a little girl is afraid in her bed because there's a big storm going on, and she runs to mom and dad's room and says, I need you to, let me sleep in your bed, I'm scared. And mom says, well, don't be scared, just go back to bed because Jesus is with you. And she says, I know that he's with me, but I need Jesus with skin on right now. And I know it's kind of a preacher story, but I think it's so true. We need Jesus with skin on. We need to meet him in other people, see his face in those who have compassion on us and lead us along the way. I think we know this because this is why when someone that we've admired or placed deep trust in fails profoundly, sometimes that is so shaking to our faith. And people have also seen visions of Jesus throughout the ages. Had very direct sorts of meetings with Jesus. St. Francis, who long ago was praying in the ruins of a church, saw the cross up above. He saw Jesus on the cross and Jesus speak to him and say, "Rebuild my church," which launched Francis off onto a ministry of healing that brought about a tremendous revival in the church. And so it is possible to meet Jesus in any and all of those ways, but whatever the meaning of how we meet him, one thing that the church has always insisted on is that it is possible to meet Jesus. This is a basic claim of the gospel. You can meet Jesus. You can really know him. You can live with him. You can live for him. And so doubt is giving up on the possibility of meeting Jesus. It's even denying that it's possible to meet him. Faith is seeking him. Faith is wanting to encounter him. We should never fear questions or doubts so long as we're open to meeting God's love in our lives. That's what I was saying earlier, that Jesus, he asked a lot of questions. He leads people through questions. Jesus expects us to be wondering and asking and thinking. Jesus wants us to be the kind of people who walk with him and who are trying to understand him more deeply. And we see Thomas arrive at that place. Verse 28. Jesus has said to him, "Stop doubting and believe." And look what Thomas's response is. He says, "My Lord and my God." And on the one hand, that's just Thomas in amazement, saying, "My Lord and my God." What is this? What am I experiencing? My Lord and my God. But it is also Thomas naming who Jesus is for him. It is this tremendous act of faith, the high point of the Gospel of John, where Thomas recognizes that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is God in the flesh. My Lord and my God. He has this encounter with Jesus, is able then to profess his faith. And I think that it's just a little bit like what Job experienced back in the Old Testament, where he says, after he'd gone through all of these tremendous trials and experiences, he says, "I had heard about you," talking about God, "I had heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes." And Thomas is changed forever by this encounter. He's just like the other disciples. When they have met Jesus, it turns their whole world upside down. He goes out. The Christian tradition tells us that Thomas went out to India, which is a pretty long way away for a guy from Palestine. He staked his life on having met the risen Lord Jesus, his Lord and his God, and he goes out as an apostle, as one who is bringing the gospel to a people far away, and he ends up dying in India. But Jesus doesn't leave it there. Verse 29, he says, "Because you have seen me and have believed, you have believed, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Jesus calls all of us to have that kind of belief that Thomas had, that seeking belief, to reach out and touch Jesus. And we didn't read this verse, but look at verse 30 and look at verse 31. Jesus did many other miracles, said other things, but the point of all of this, in verse 31, John says, is that we may come to believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. The point of all of this is life. Being able to live a life with Jesus, in Jesus, through Jesus. The point of all of this is immensely practical. It's not a head game. It's to get out there, to live this life of belief. That's what Thomas was called to. That's what we're called to. Meet Jesus and believe. So where are you at? Do you need to meet Jesus again in your life? Do you need to encounter his risen power in your life afresh? Are you not sure about whether you believe or if you believe or what you believe? Well, I'm convinced that Jesus is real and that he wants to save all of our lives. I'm convinced that if we seek Jesus, he shows up. I'm convinced that Jesus wants us to meet him just like he met Thomas in that upper room. And I'm convinced that all of us can reach out and touch Jesus and believe. Amen.